folks are coming in. Welcome everyone. I believe we'll wait for about just a minute before I hand it over to Christian and we get today's discussion on improving nuclear crisis communication started.
All right, we'll give it just a little bit more. Sylvia, let me know whenever you think we are good to go.
I think we're good to go.
Okay. All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Improving Nuclear Hotlines, Experts Speak. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in virtually this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are in the world, for what is sure to be a very interesting conversation. As a reminder, during this event, please feel free to submit questions on Zoom in the Q&A section or in the chat section, and we will reserve some time to answer them in the end. Additionally, thank you to those who have already submitted questions. My name is Christian Steins, and I'm a technology policy analyst at the Institute for Security and Technology, a West Coast-based think tank whose mission is to bridge gaps between technology and policy leaders and help solve emerging security problems arising from the risks that new technologies pose to global security. At IST, I work on the Catalink initiative, which proposes an additive multilateral crisis communication system as a solution to address the urgent lack of modern multilateral crisis communication channels among nuclear-armed state leaders. Last year, in support of this effort, we launched the Crisis Communications Resilience Working Group, bringing together a network of experts and practitioners who work collaboratively to augment nuclear risk reduction efforts and promote the idea and implementation of effective, secure multilateral crisis communications among nuclear-armed states. During the past few months, I've had the pleasure to work with several of our working group members and launch a series of reports on improving nuclear hotlines, relevance, and use cases, which the guiding idea behind these reports was to think through and build out use case scenarios, emphasizing the need for states to use multilateral crisis communications and assess the current status of these crisis communications in several of the nuclear-armed states, including Russia, China, India, Pakistan, the US, the UK, and France. Today, we are very lucky to be joined by the authors themselves for a discussion of their findings and delve deeper into the broader implications and benefits of crisis communication channels as a risk reduction tool. Before I turn it over to Sylvia Mishra, our Deputy Director of Nuclear Policy here at IST for the moderated discussion, I'd like to introduce our authors. We are joined today by Dr. Rabia Akhtar, a Dean of the Faculty of the School of Social Sciences at the University of Lahore, a professor of international relations. She is the founding director of the Center for Security, Strategy, and Policy Research and the School of Integrated Social Sciences at the University of Lahore. Dr. Akhtar has a PhD in security studies from Kansas State University. Her scholarly pursuits have revolved around key areas such as South Asian nuclear security, deterrence dynamics, media in the age of deepfakes and disinformation, nuclear weapons, AI and emerging technologies, Pakistan's foreign policy, and national security imperatives, as well as regional and international security issues. She has authored a book titled The Blind Eye, U.S. Non-Proliferation Policy Towards Pakistan from Ford to Clinton, and she is a non-resident senior fellow at the South Asia Center Atlantic Council. She's a visiting fellow at the Project for Managing the Atom Belfer Center in the Harvard Kennedy School. Next, we are joined by Dr. Manpreet Sethi, a distinguished fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi, where she heads its program on nuclear issues. She's also a senior research advisor at Asian Pacific Leadership Network. She's a recipient of the K. Subramaniam Award, and a commendation by the Chief of Air Staff, and a commendation by Commander-in-Chief of the Strategic Forces Command. Since receiving her doctorate in 1997, she has worked on nuclear energy, strategy, arms control risk, reduction, and disarmament. And she's the author, co-editor, and editor of 9 books and over 130 papers. She's also a co-chair of Women in Nuclear in India and the Working Group on Reducing Pathways to Nuclear Use at the Belfer Center at Harvard University, and a board member of the Missile Dialogue Initiative at IISS. We are also joined by Dmitry Stefanovich, a research fellow at the Center for International Security at the Primkov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations of the Russian Academy of Sciences, a member of the Council for Foreign Relations and Defense Policy, and a member of the PIR Center Advisory Board. Dmitry graduated with honors from the Institute of International Relations of Moscow Engineering Physics Institute with a specialist degree in international relations. In 2019, he was a visiting research fellow at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. From 2022 to 2023, he was a member of the first P5 Young Professionals team. He's also a participant in numerous Track 2 and Track 1.5 dialogues, as well as other international projects. He's also an author of numerous publications for academic journals, think tanks, and media sources. His research interests include strategic weapons, long-range precision weapons, hypersonic weapons, space weaponization, disruptive technologies, and their impact on international security, strategic stability, arms control, and regional security. And finally, we are joined by Daniel Zubkov, a War Studies MA candidate at King's College London and a 2024 Nuclear Risk Reduction Fellow at the Council on Strategic Risks. Currently participates in IST's Crisis Communications Resilience Group and also participates in the Young Deep Cuts Commission. Dan previously worked at Stanford University's Center for International Security Cooperation as Rose Gottemüller's research assistant, supporting a range of projects related to nuclear arms control and US-Russia relations. He was also a 2022 Nuclear Scholar at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, project on nuclear issues. Dan was also born in Russia and received his BA in History and Political Science at the University of California, Los Angeles. Thank you all again for joining us. And now over to Sylvia Mishra for the moderated discussion.
Thank you, Christian. Once again, welcome to our panelists and also to our live audience. I know we have a lot of our esteemed colleagues joining us from across the globe. So welcome. As Christian said, that for the last couple of months, it has been a really pleasure working with our crisis communication resilience working group that IST, along with Philip and myself, we steer. And during this time period, we were asked several times by stakeholders in the field and also experts that at what point of time during a crisis would a multilateral crisis communication come into use? And to answer that question, we gathered some of the best from our working group members to really take a region-specific approach, narrating what crisis communication might look like, why multilateral crisis communication, even though it is looked as an important risk reduction and preventive diplomacy tool, has not yet gained traction, specifically why there is such little political support behind the idea of a multilateral crisis communication. To delve into several of these questions, we'll jump straight into our moderated discussion. Just a bit of housekeeping rule. We would have this moderated discussion for the next 45 minutes. And because we have a great number of excellent audience members who have already sent a couple of questions, I want this discussion to be more interactive. So we'll make space for audience questions and we'll go from there. Just one point I wanted to underscore, whilst doing these reports, we also got a chance to interview Dr. Tong Zhao, who unfortunately was not able to join us because of his travels, but he has a fantastic Q&A with myself, and I know that that report will also be circulated with everyone. With that, I would go right to you, Manpreet. You in your report, you raise a very important point about how in South Asia, this idea of confidence building mechanism, and especially the Directorate General of Military Operations have been in operation for several decades. You also write that there are several bilateral lines amongst local commanders. However, you do raise and write in your report that the effectiveness and the timeliness of these channels of communication perhaps can offer a certain space of doubt. It would be great if you're able to elaborate on this point and also tell us what do you think? Because I know that several of the CBMs are now not operational between India and Pakistan. So what is the path forward in terms of also thinking not just a bilateral mechanism, but perhaps a multilateral mechanism, which is more region specific, looking at China, India, and Pakistan, perhaps?
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Thank you for this opportunity to participate in this webinar. And in fact, earlier to think deeply about this subject to produce a paper that you kindly published. My compliments to all my co-panelists. Excellent papers by each one of you. Really enjoyed reading, and I think it was like bringing together pieces of the jigsaw to understand how different stakeholders look at this particular issue. So you've specifically asked me about the 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 hotlines between the DGMOs, the Director Generals of Military Operations, between India and Pakistan, which have now existed for over 50 years. They started sometime in the early 1970s, and they've been used with mixed results over the decades, I would say. We had earlier heard about the technical difficulties that were faced with noisy and often non-available lines given the state of telecommunications in the region and in both the countries. But with technological advances and the laying down of fiber optic cables, etc., this problem has been overcome. And what we have today are well-established procedures and protocols around the hotlines. On a fixed day every week, there is a call which is undertaken by the DGMOs at both ends to talk, and mostly to resolve tactical issues or operational issues on the ground. The DGMO hotlines, I think, over time have been assured of resilience and technical availability. That's not been a problem. However, during the India-Pakistan crisis, I think even if they've been technically or procedurally available, two other kinds of challenges have been seen. The first is when the two countries have politically shut themselves off from using these hotlines. So even if they've existed, it's a decision that's been taken that they are not going to use these hotlines. And the second one, where I want to bring in the Indian experience, has been where Pakistan has deliberately worked towards masking its real intent or indulging in bluster or consciously trying to mislead. One such instance was during the Kargil intrusions in Pakistan by the Pakistan army in the guise of the Mujahideen, where the Indian side, according to the people who were manning these hotlines, was met with what they called, quote unquote, feigned ignorance or even misleading information. But the usefulness of the hotlines was reportedly very high when the coordination on the withdrawal of the Pakistan army from Indian territory was to be taken once the political decision had been made. In some other instances, we've also seen the DGMO hotlines being very gainfully used, where instances where helicopters from either side have strayed into the other's territory because of bad weather, or to ensure compliance of the ceasefire at the line of control, or even to help each other in times of disaster. During an earthquake in Muzaffarabad in 2005, we had humanitarian relief being coordinated by opening crossing points, which were coordinated by these hotlines. So overall, then, I think the military hotlines have worked effectively with strict procedural protocols. Improved technologies have made them more resilient. So they're certainly available and they are far more secure than they used to be. But because of some aspersions that have been cast by both sides on the content of the information, I think that is something that one has to sort of look at more carefully. Because this between two nuclear armed states can have serious consequences, while both can build the technical resilience of hotlines. It is only through a sustained and a consistent habit of honest engagement, where both are aware of the risks of dishonesty or miscommunication, that this can translate into a good CBM. At the multilateral level, I think we are still some distance from that, because you might want to have third parties coming into the picture based on your comfort level with them. But to have an institutionalized multilateral system of communication between India, China, Pakistan for crisis management, I think there are problems and challenges there. But let me hear what the others have to say about this.
Thank you, Manpreet. I think that is the perfect segue because Rabia in her paper does talk about the importance of perhaps bringing in third-party interlocutors, but we have seen that the third-party interlocutors playing an important role during several of the India-Pakistan crises. So in terms of a specific crisis communication or preventive diplomacy, how does that play into Pakistan's approach of crisis communication? And Rabia, in your paper, you also really paint out a interesting hypothetical scenario where a multilateral communication hotline can kick in. I found what Manpreet said about the building the technical resiliency and as a habit of cooperation as well. But it would be interesting to hear from you both on the third party stepping in, but also maybe perhaps reacting to Manpreet's thesis on how do you protect the content of information conveyed, especially if the intent is bluster or miscommunication for that matter.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. First of all, let me start by thanking you, Christian, Philip, and your team at IST for putting these reports out, all of them in very interesting perspectives, and I really enjoyed reading all of them. In my paper, I have talked about third parties and as to how they can, come together and formalize a crisis communications mechanism in South Asia. So historically, as you know, it's a very learned audience here, as well as the attendees, the list that I was saying. Historically, India and Pakistan, have relied on third parties, especially the United States, for managing their crises. And however, there is no formalized communication mechanisms which have been put in place despite this dependency and reliance that we have seen over a period of years. Past crises such as Pulwama Balakot or the BrahMos missile launch in 2022, they underscore the importance of effective crisis communication to prevent escalation. But it's a matter of who's going to pick up the phone first and where the first phone call is going to go. But that's still not a formalized procedure. There definitely are, challenges and opportunities. There, Manpreet has talked about lack of trust and political will to use existing crisis communication channels between India and Pakistan, which actually makes the role of third parties very, very crucial. Because third-party involvement, I believe, can help transcend the limitations of bilateral communication at a time when India and Pakistan do not have the political will to pick up the phone despite the lines being open. That's especially the time when we need third parties to come in and, help us deal with this deep-seated mistrust between the two countries. The multilateral crisis mechanisms, involving countries like United States, China, can significantly enhance regional stability and security. We have seen their back-channel roles in a series of crises since our nuclearization in 1998 onwards. And such mechanism, I believe, would provide a platform for dialogue as well as negotiation, bringing strategic leverage as well as international influence, which is crucial for de-escalation. All of these variables, even though a bilateral, communication is the first step to go, but that's where we don't see political will and resolve and a huge mistrust between India and Pakistan. So I believe that's where third parties can come in. The involvement of major powers, however, given the current geopolitical, dynamics, can also complicate trust dynamics, given their respective alliances with India and Pakistan, with Pakistan and China on one side and India and US on the other side. And to mitigate this, incorporating additional neutral parties like UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, or any other international organizations into a formal mechanism could help balance the influence of major powers, and I believe it can foster a more equitable environment. Also, I think there's a need to build trust over time. Regular structured engagement within a multilateral framework can help build trust over time as parties, witness consistent and fair behavior from all involved. And Pakistan won't say that, India is close to the US, so why as US is not a neutral party. And similarly, things cannot be said in the same vein for China. So you need to have a broader multilateral framework with more neutral parties involved. And this shift in focus, I believe, from national alliances to collective regional stability can benefit all stakeholders by enhancing communication and reducing the risk of misperceptions as well as inadvertent escalation. I would like to give a shout out to BASIC, with which we partnered both in India and Pakistan to work on crisis communication, and we published jointly with authors like Chiara from BASIC, Ruhi from IPCS, Alice and Nicholas Wheeler from BASIC. And we also looked at the importance of communication in crisis. And we also talked about, what Manpreet's report talks about, existing communication mechanisms. And some of the challenges of crisis communication that came out between India and Pakistan, again, we highlighted that there is mutual distrust and there are limits of effective information sharing. And it is not a question of only what Pakistan has done, but also, India on the other side as well. And misinterpretation of signals, for example, the complete silence of 48 hours when BrahMos was launched, the jury is still out whether it was accidental or deliberate, talks of the kind of challenges that we are talking about. You add to the mix the role of media, social media, and it complicates real-time information and shaping public opinion. So there's that aspect as well. I do believe that, incorporating emerging technologies such as, blockchain to secure communication challenge can help in maintaining the confidentiality and reliability of shared information. But for that, obviously, again, some level of trust, some level of, information sharing platforms needs to be available. And I don't think that despite, these years of nuclearization since 1998, India and Pakistan are not mature enough to, bilaterally communicate. They still are in the experimental phases of testing each other's thresholds under the nuclear umbrella, and it's a dangerous place. So I do believe that an effective multilateral formal framework or mechanism can help India and Pakistan get over some of the mistrust that they have, in a place where there are neutral stakeholders as well. I'd like to stop here and would love to listen to what others have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabia. I think I do agree with you about the issue of really formalizing some communication channels. And even though we have seen some institutionalized mechanisms of crisis communication, perhaps those are not being as effectively used. So kind of moving on a little bit from the South Asia experience, I think that's also the perfect segue to bring in Dimitri over here. Dimitri, you've in your paper kind of written that it's difficult to kind of sustain political will and these formalized bilateral channels of communications, specifically when you see the other side's intent is to escalate or engender greater risk. In such a situation, and especially with the what we are seeing with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, there's also this narrative that Russia and NATO has been able to avoid some major clash, also because of effectively communicating through some of these formalized channels of communication. So I wanted to hear from you and your thoughts on like what is the balance. On one hand, we are seeing that because of lack of trust and political will. There's a dwindling interest, if you may say, in carrying forward institutionalized communication. But on the other hand, we are seeing the effectiveness of averting inadvertent escalation in an ongoing conflict situation. Over to you, Dima.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a huge honor to be part of this team and part of this project. And I value very much the insights from my colleagues. I would also want to emphasize that on the one hand, the experiences are slightly different, and we have different level of institutionalization of crisis communications. But the most important part is that whenever there is a crisis between nuclear powers, it is effectively a nuclear crisis. Because even given that sometimes people downplay or overplay the nuclear dimension of, for example, current conflict between Russia and the US, it is still there. This nuclear shadow still exists, and that's why people should be extremely careful, both decision makers and the general public. And actually, this is what I would also want to emphasize, that what was already said by Rabia, that sometimes, well, in the era of social media, in the era when basically everyone is kind of a journalist, everyone is kind of opinion maker, it is very easy to very rapidly delve into a very, very threatening situation. That's why, to some extent, it is really important for even for the state authorities to keep some communications not public, but at the same time to ensure that there is some public messaging as well. And of course, it can, like the balance between the two is being decided by every country themselves. We all know these words like megaphone diplomacy and so on, because sometimes it's an easy win from the propaganda standpoint just to label your adversary as the source of all possible evil, of all possible threats and risks, which is not always the case, to put it mildly. And from the academic perspective, from the scholarly perspective, it seems very clear that there can't be too much communications. You need to have these links. The officials need to be constantly in touch, not because it is some sort of appeasement or some sort of being soft, but simply because, and I'm confident in that, that any nuclear weapon state has no interest in having a direct confrontation with any of the other nuclear weapon states or alliances, because ultimately there is a clear understanding where it will lead us. But unfortunately, again, due to some political thinking, political calculus, sometimes those tools are not used. Sometimes they're used in not in good faith, to put it this way, which doesn't mean that tools are bad. It is always a matter of, in the end, a matter of the people who are using them. And I would also want to mention another important factor, that sometimes the institutes that were developed for crisis communications, like the NERCs and RRCs, they become used a bit too much and become overburdened with data sharing, with transmittal of some routine notifications and so on, which to some extent lowers interest in using these mechanisms for what was their original purpose. I believe Dan might tell even more about the situation, but like the number of notifications that have been transmitted between Russian and American NERCs, like it is enormous. And whenever when I have a chance to talk to some people who know their work from the inside, their main concern is always like, people simply like do what they do, their job. They are sometimes even not thinking that they might be the saviors of the universe in a crisis. So just a bit of more spotlight on these operations might be very useful. And IST is doing a good job in emphasizing that crisis communications, like you should not take them for granted. You need to put some effort in to make them actually work. What else to say here? I'd say that like the dynamics of crisis communications and risk taking and so on, they are very complicated because sometimes some people, some countries might be interested in actually doing something like instigating, create risks. So the other side will reach out to them and have some some discussion, high-level discussion, or you can impose risks. So the other side would be more interested in discussing risk reduction, in institutionalizing your relations and discussing the stuff you care about. I would not put any blame to any of the countries, especially given that we are not Chatham House, but I am absolutely sure that examples of such behavior can be found in any major player on current global arena for different reasons. For sometimes it might be absolutely benign reason, just like to force your possible adversary back to the talking table, to return to diplomacy instead of going closer to actual clash. But again, it is always a matter of perception, because some actions, and like the good example is the one that I've actually explained in my paper, that some actions by one country that are perceived as deterrence and reassurance then might be perceived as threatening by the other country. And this is the reality. I mean, like, we're all different. We all have different strategic cultures and so on. And again, sorry for once again thanking IST. It's really good that you assembled such a diverse group of people for this project, so we can try to bridge this gap in strategic thinking about all these topics. Well, I hope I've answered your question to some extent, and I'm looking forward to our further discussion. Thank you.
Yes, Dimitri, I think you raised several interesting points, and you do talk about the utility of NORC at length in your paper. There's one follow-up question that I'll come back to you about. You said that because like you almost seem to hint that there needs to be more spotlighting about of the work that NORC is doing because of the enormous burden also it carries in terms of the volume of information shared between US and Russia. I would like to later come back to you and ask you how do you think or what are some of the additive steps that could be taken in order to support NORC? Many of the times we do hear from nuclear armed states on a track 1.5, track 2 discussions on following and advancing a NORC model. So, your thoughts on this would be greatly appreciated, and I'll come back to you later. But going over to Daniel, you have an excellent paper with Rose Gottemuller on the history of NORC. And in your paper for IST, you raise a very important point. Like, so far, we heard about the importance of communication. I think Dimitri said that there cannot be too much communication. But right now, steering and discussing a little bit about communication amongst allies, which is equally important. And you raise a very important point that whilst we talk about deliberate / inadvertent escalation, but a lot of miscommunication can also happen amongst allies, and especially given the rapidity and the pace of war that we are seeing, it would be really interesting to kind of hear from you how allies can resolve miscommunication, especially when the fog of war thickens. Daniel?
Hi, Sylvia, and once again, echoing the rest of my co-authors, many thanks to the Institute for Security and Technology for assembling the entire working group and giving us the opportunity to write our reports. It was an especially great opportunity for me to think on this important topic and learn from my esteemed co-authors from their briefs. Now, to very briefly summarize my paper, as you mentioned, my proposal centers on a trilateral crisis communications channel between the heads of state in the US, the UK, and France. And I argue that such a mechanism between nuclear armed allies, as opposed to adversaries, can provide capabilities for swift communication and decision-making in times of crisis, to enhance resilience and redundancy of those channels, and to make sure that they can clarify urgently if any potential misunderstandings arise. And to answer specifically your question, I think there's a lot of instances going back in history, especially when the events maybe were not developing as rapidly, when we saw in postmortems, allies recognized how close maybe they have come to disaster and how imperative it has been to communicate clearly between each other, going back to the Cuban Missile Crisis with the Kennedy administration and his executive committee determining how to reach out to the Allied leaders and communicate their decisions vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, going back to the 1983 Able Archer moment when, after the fact, the UK Prime Minister Thatcher realized that what the US and NATO has been doing during the exercise may have indeed incited greater alarm among the Soviet leadership. And now that the fog of war can be much more complicated due to various emerging technologies, as information moves much more rapidly through public space, social media, etc., this kind of communication that's resilient, swift, and redundant between allies also needs to happen much swifter. And I think we need to envision different scenarios for policymakers and their staff that demonstrate the importance of such channels being upgraded and made. To take another historical example from the US side, in 1977, President Jimmy Carter participated in the Ivory Item nuclear strike exercise. And one of the outcomes of that exercise was the US nuclear establishment really looking at the importance of shoring up vulnerabilities in the command, control, communications, and intelligence infrastructure to make sure that communications would be steady and would be survivable in the event of a nuclear exchange. And this is arguably much easier to implement among allies as opposed to adversaries, holding these kinds of channels, holding these kinds of simulations and bringing diplomats from allied countries together to talk about these scenarios. And as my co-authors mentioned, in terms of bringing a multilateral channel into practice, the baseline level of trust that is required for such a measure is already existing between allies and can be implemented much steadier. But another point worth considering is that a secure and rapid communications channel can provide confidence in the source of the messages that you receive from it, as by authenticating whom you're speaking to. This insight is especially derived from the work of the US and Russian nuclear risk reduction centers that have been mentioned by Dima. And this is something that's important, that even in the environment where a lot of different conflicting messages, a lot of rumors may be swirling around, if you receive a message through this channel where you know who your interlocutor is, you can be at the very least assured that there is not a third party trying to spoof and trick you. Now, of course, going back to what Manpreet, Rabia, and Dima all said, it is up to your interlocutor to be honest with you. In an allied setting, this is much less of a problem, hopefully, that your allies will not be trying to trick you. But going back to the broader theme that we've been all touching on, the technical tools themselves can provide the means to do so, but it is up to people communicating with each other to be honest and build that trust through regular and honest behavior.
Thanks, Daniel, for that overview. I thought this is again, you did talk about spoofing and the impact of emerging and disruptive technologies, which is pretty much a good segue for what we wanted to hear from our authors also in terms of their thinking about the impact of emerging technologies on crisis communication. And then just as a little bit of backdrop, the two projects that I see is leading on specific on nuclear crisis communication was born out of this idea that our NC3 system, our nuclear command control and communications, could be vulnerable going forward with the integration of several emerging technologies, specifically looking at artificial intelligence or a slew of challenge that we are facing in terms of deepfakes or in terms of misinformation and disinformation. So this entire idea of CAT-LINK, which is a multilateral additive nuclear communication system amongst heads of state, and as we are trying to develop a blueprint of that, really discusses our efforts in terms of like really securing crisis communication channels from an attack of emerging and disruptive technologies, or even like looking at the combination of EDTs and how they kind of play into or undermine nuclear NC3. So with that, I really wanted to kind of get a quick round of input from our authors. This is something we are also at ISC, we are also beginning to think through in a more focused manner. For example, like, do we really need a hotline now with a focus on just AI, artificial intelligence incidents, etc. So I would like to call on and maybe perhaps go in the order of getting Dimitri, and then looking to Rabia, Dan, and Manpreet for your input on EDTs and crisis communications.
Okay. Well, first I'll answer your first question about how to help NERCs to work, and it would be just maybe write more often about how good their work is and has been, and how important it is to sustain the operations, and like that those are important. Basically, this is all we can do from the expert community, and we also should be really careful in talking about some new ideas, what else they can do, and so on, because yeah, it might lead to other different outcomes. On your question about EDTs, well, there are two schools of thought. I'm pretty sure you're aware about it. One is that everything is connected, and second, that just don't make a salad. Just don't put everything into one pile, because you will not be able to digest it, and will you not be able to find a solution. So I believe that it actually can be we can have both. So there can be some dedicated lines of communication on selected EDTs, like the one we've had. Actually, I think it's still alive. It was not disbanded. The hotline on cyber incidents between Moscow and Washington. But at the same time, if there is some cyber incident that involves nuclear weapons-related facilities, it definitely can be discussed through NERC. And also, we are not in a position to tell what should be the topics for discussion at the levels, for example, of joint chiefs of staff, head and chairman and head of the Russian general staff. Like, they can discuss whatever they want. Same is true for the national security advisor and secretary of the Security Council and things like that. So, I mean, it's good to have dedicated communication lines where you can bring in more technical experts on a short notice and so on. But at the same time, everything is so interconnected these days that just like making that you talk only about nuclear weapons, you cannot talk about conventional cruise missiles. You talk only about AI, you cannot say anything about quantum communications and things like that. They will not help. But having dedicated lines for like technical discussions might be useful. So that will be my short answer. Thanks.
Thank you, Rabia.
Yes. So I think on emerging and disruptive technologies, I'm glad that the attention is being drawn to this, because there's like a whole host of concerns regarding security and reliability of communication challenges. cyber attacks and intrusion, right? Advanced cyber threats, they can target communication infrastructure, they can lead to potential breaches, data theft, or disruption of communication channels. And this compromises the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of critical information. And there are a whole host of examples out there that tell us to look at it. AI technologies can be weaponized to conduct sophisticated cyber attacks, including deepfake audios and videos, which can be used to manipulate or falsify information. And I don't think we are doing enough work in this realm to raise awareness about the risk of misinformation and miscommunication, especially during crises. The integration of AI and other advanced technologies into communication systems can introduce new vulnerabilities that adversaries can exploit. And ensuring robustness and resilience of these systems against the threats is crucial. You've talked about escalation risks. So inaccurate and manipulated communication due to technological interference can lead to misunderstanding, potentially escalating conflicts. Then there is whole, technological complexity of communication systems incorporating AI and other advanced technologies, which can make them difficult to secure as well as maintain. And then there is overall, trust in the authenticity and accuracy of communication, which is absolutely essential, especially during crisis. And these disruptive technologies can undermine this trust and can severely impact diplomatic as well as military decision-making processes. So, what can we do in order to, we know of this potential fallout of disruptive technologies, but how do we, sort of integrate emerging technologies into weapon systems as well as communication channels without, that pose this significant threat? The speed we have seen at which the conflicts can escalate increases dramatically with advanced technologies like AI-enabled missile guidance and detection systems. And there is rapid response capabilities that can lead to quick, retaliatory actions that reduce the window for diplomatic resolution. I've talked about, miscommunication, misperception. Would like to talk about reduced human oversight. That is also one area that we need to look at because automated AI-driven systems, they might reduce human oversight, leading to decisions that are based potentially on flawed algorithms or data. And lack of human judgment in critical situation can result in unintended escalation. We all know that, and there is much literature about it, but how can we improve crisis communication channels? Just, some thoughts on it. We need to have obviously enhanced cybersecurity measures, implementing advanced cybersecurity protocol, which can include encryption, intrusion detection systems, as well as regular security audits. They can help protect communication channels from cyber threats. We also need to have some backup systems and redundancy built into the overall system. Establishing multiple redundant communication channels can ensure that if one channel is compromised during crisis, others remain operational. We can use AI and machine learning to detect and mitigate cyber threats in real time and can help protect communication infrastructure. And these technologies can identify anomalies and potential threats faster than human operators. So let's use them in order to, benefit from what they can provide us. I think conducting regular crisis communication simulations, for example, involving multiple stakeholders, can ensure the preparedness and identify potential vulnerabilities in the system as well. I have not seen such exercises being held outside of track 1. So I think we need to broaden the circle and bring in more, track 2s on this subject specifically. And then overall international collaboration and norm. I think we need to promote international cooperation to establish these norms and agreements on responsible use of emerging technologies in military system that can reduce the risk of escalation. And this includes agreements on the use of AI in NC3 systems, as well as joint cybersecurity efforts. I think if we build trust and transparency, if we have enough educational training programs, if we have continuous monitoring as well as adaptation, and we develop resilient systems, by taking these steps, we can have better preparedness for the potential fallout, because there's just no escaping that. I'd like to stop here. Thanks.
Thanks, Rabia, for a very interesting, putting forward a very interesting idea about broadening the scope of crisis simulations outside just the policy circuit. Would like to hear from Dan and then Manpreet. And I would say that after we hear from Dan and Manpreet, we would open the floor for discussion. I already see several interesting questions for our speakers, so we'll then quickly move to Q&A after this. Dan.
Well, I will be relatively brief. I certainly will gladly echo what my colleagues have stated so far about the potential fallouts and the technical solutions. I think Rabi especially gave a really comprehensive answer. Completely agreed with the need to establish redundancy of communication channels to make sure there's no single point of failure, and already established examples such as the hotline agreements between the US and Russia, the nuclear risk reduction centers, they all integrate that very well. So it's worth looking at those examples. I would add two things to that. So one, disentangling communication channels from infrastructure that may be targeted in a conventional crisis before it reaches the nuclear threshold is one additional way to reduce the chances of triggering nuclear escalation due to miscalculation or misinterpretation of which systems specifically are being targeted. So, for example, if the United States nuclear command and control infrastructure is closely linked to dynamic targeting satellites, which may be targeted in a conflict that does not yet cross the nuclear threshold, the targeting of NC3 systems may be interpreted as an imminent attack on the nuclear level. And so the US might act accordingly as one example of a potential escalation scenario. However, all the technical measures that we've talked about so far will not be a silver bullet if your adversary wants to deliberately render your communications channels useless. And so an additional measure is going to be normative, and this may be a bit more contentious, but it has to do with making a decision to exercise restraint in a crisis and forswearing targeting NC3 infrastructure for your adversary, and hopefully convincing the adversaries to do the same, take the same stance. Now, of course, this needs to follow from a recognition that in a near nuclear or nuclear crisis, it would hopefully be in all sides' interest to get talking as soon as possible, as Dima alluded to earlier, and talk as quickly as possible to de-escalate that crisis and prevent total annihilation. And at least in the US, this recognition speaks to a long-standing debate about nuclear deterrence at its core. Is its chief purpose to prevent nuclear war, or is the chief purpose of the military establishment to prevail in the nuclear war if it does break out? And refraining from targeting your opponent's NC3 systems and not seeking capabilities that would let you do that really falls squarely within the prevention category. And that could help mitigate the challenge from emerging technologies as well, but it is at its core a political and strategic decision that needs to be made first. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Manpreet, we heard a lot of discussion on like EDTs being destabilizing for crisis comms, but at the onset of your remarks, you did mention that over the years, both India and Pakistan has worked to kind of build in technical resiliency. So along with this idea about EDTs making crisis comms more vulnerable, what about taking the help of emerging technologies to kind of really build in technical resiliency for crisis communication channels? If you could also shed some light on that side of the debate and discussion.
Yes, thanks so much, Sylvia, because all the three panelists have spoken so well, and bits and pieces of what I wanted to say have already been said by them. So it's a good idea to focus a little differently on this question. See, concerns about disruptive technologies, especially their intersection with nuclear deterrence, are inevitable. Right from the beginning, if you look at books of the 60s that are talking about new technologies at that time, they were also seen to be disruptive and how they would impact nuclear deterrence. But sometimes the breathlessness that we are attaching to today's EDTs, I think you just need to take a step back to see whether the basics of deterrence are actually going to change by with any of this. I mean, I'm not, reducing or minimizing the impact of possibilities or vulnerabilities, but particularly which Rabia very nicely raised about, all kinds of vulnerabilities that can come in. And especially with the use of artificial intelligence like deep fakes or disinformation, uh, or cyber offensives, it can compromise the security and the reliability of communication channels. In the case of India, Pakistan, and Rabia will remember this. It was, I think, in 2008 that after the terror strike, there was the news about some kind of a hoax call that had been made supposedly by the Indian Prime Minister to the Pakistani counterpart. And I think the lesson that was drawn from here was not having predictable communication procedures allowed for something like this to really happen. And having experienced that, I think the understanding of the possibilities of what can go wrong in crisis is so much the better. But a few things that I'd like you to just pause and think about. One is it in the interest of parties in a crisis to cause such disruption to communication channels? In theory, we know you can disrupt communication channels. As Rabia said, we need to make them redundant. As Dan said, those vulnerabilities have to be plugged. But would causing disruption to the communication channels be in the interest of a country? Because you would then be exacerbating chances of nuclear use by the adversary. So, is that something which is good or bad? So, even if the possibility exists, would nations like to exercise that particular, possibility? In a crisis, would you rather have a panicking adversary who's on the edge, or would you prefer a calm and a more assured adversary who is keen to engage with you on resolving the crisis rather than getting into a military action? I think the second issue here is awareness that these things can happen. And as I said, one incident has made India and Pakistan aware of this. And therefore, it would naturally induce caution that if you are hearing something that seems to be out of the ordinary of what that crisis is about, you would want to corroborate the facts by more than one method. And technologies are giving us those advantages now, being able to corroborate in many ways. So whether it's through space-based capabilities or through intelligence coming from various other technical sources, you can corroborate it before jumping to conclusion and therefore, going down that slippery path. Thirdly, the whole point of hotlines, in contrast to ordinary cellular or internet networks, is to have secure communication, including with encryption. So, to prevent signal interception where the hardware and the software vulnerabilities have been taken care of. So, awareness again gives you that ability to harden against such degradation, so that crisis communication factors in all of these during the planning and the design stage. And lastly, even amidst all this noise, if the adversaries can be sure of being able to communicate either on a secure channel or through intermediaries, we are putting too much of our emphasis only on the technologies. But we have seen the best of communication has happened with human intermediaries. And if both sides are going to, the confidence of the leaders on both sides is going to be with some human intermediaries, then we could meet the challenge of disruptive technologies. I'm not saying that we don't have to work on norms or hardening or plugging the vulnerabilities, but I'm just giving an alternative view of how you could do that by going back to the basics once again.
Thank you. I thought that was a really very an important idea to capture in the debate. I'm also kind of reminded of a fantastic paper by Heather Williams and Jessica Cox, which talks about like really leveraging on these technologies to better understand and clarify adversaries' intent. Because so taking advantage of EDDs to clarify adversaries' intent, even though that is an challenging and an enormous task, but especially given the rapid pace of how a war is moving, I think that's extremely important, and that's so well put. So now we are going to delve into some of the audience questions. Audience members, put your thinking caps on, and please send us some of your question. I would like to start with this question that is from Alizia, which I think is really pertinent in today's time. And he asked, what is the likelihood of using hotlines in an environment when leaders are being more risk acceptant? And I think that is something that we are seeing across the board in different nuclear, like especially in like heads of state in different nuclear armed countries. So would like to see if someone, one of our panelists would like to volunteer and take a stab at this question.
I can go first and then we
Okay.
can have the other.
Okay.
But
Yeah,
I
sure.
think the value of hotlines only goes up when your leaders are risk acceptant. Because, I mean, if you're going to land up in a situation which is going to be difficult for the two sides, ultimately your crisis management has to be only through communication. And whether that communication happens through hotlines, which are at the political level or at the more ground military level, that has to be the only way out of the solution. So it's the nature of leadership is not going to take away or reduce the value of the hotline in any way. It's only going to increase the value of the hotline. As long as we have those which are, as I mentioned, technically, politically, and procedurally resilient.
Right. Going forward, I think because we are getting several interesting questions, it would be perhaps good to kind of do a roundup of two questions at a time. But would anyone else would like to respond to this question? Dima, please.
Yeah, I would also agree with what Manpreet said. If there is risk, and as I've said previously, like there is always an ultimate risk of the explicit direct military conflict between nuclear powers, which will escalate to the nuclear threshold rather rapidly. So, like, it is in the interest of the country that actually incites risks to keep the hotline alive. And actually, this is one of the serious issues that prevents some active risk reduction measures between, for example, US and China, because China and Russia to some extent believes that US is creating risks so that to force Russia, China and Russia to discuss risk reductions, new hotlines, and so on. So yeah, this is there is no discrepancy. You can have both risks and hotlines.
Rabia?
Yeah, just very briefly, I was intrigued by what Manpreet said, and rightly so, that, during a crisis, you would want an adversary that is assured and is not panicking. But if I was to play devil's advocate and take a different look at what Ali's question is about risk acceptance, then if a leader is risk acceptant, they might prolong or delay the use of hotlines just to see, as to how far they can take the tipping point. I know it's dangerous, especially during a crisis, but it is not completely, out of the blue. In order to coerce, it could be a coercive measure. In order to coerce your adversary to cave in first and to, pick up the phone first, could also be a strategy for a risk acceptant leader who would want to delay it just to, provoke panic.
Dan, I see your hand.
Just very briefly to add to what all my esteemed colleagues said, that ultimately it is up to all adversaries in a crisis like this to pick up the phone in order for hotlines to have actual substantive value. But it is worth pointing out that if a leader whom the other side perceives as risk acceptance still is willing to continue engaging in those risk reduction measures and try picking up the phone first, that is still that first step to get to talking, to try to actually de-escalate the situation. And it then really is incumbent on the other party to answer in kind instead of, as Rabia said, trying to prolong it further and further. So I think, yeah, going back to Manfred's original point of being able to actually talk about it is really, really key.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought those were fantastic responses from our panelists. I have a question over here which talks about whether we should apply the same national law from nuclear weapons to supersonic weapons. What are your recommendations for crisis communication, taking into account the unpredictability related to change of management? I think we did hear our panelists discuss about the importance of also like people and human operator and like training of personnel. So in terms of management, what are some of the recommendations from our panelists on this? And then there's a question from Tanvi, which is specifically for Manpreet and Rabia, and she talks about, and she's in agreement about the lack of political will and trust and the difficulty in ensuring that. However, she mentions that, but arms control mechanisms and arms control treaties are more difficult to implement, and in comparison, crisis communication channels or hotlines are perhaps more easier to, perhaps easier, but like in comparison, easier to implement. And she also talks about like crisis communication channels or hotlines having selective compliance, and therefore she's asking your thoughts and perspectives on this. Would Dimitri want to perhaps respond to the first question on a change of management, personnel training, and perhaps looking at applying some of the laws in terms of emerging technologies? Also, I think the person mentioned about supersonic weapons.
Yeah, well, I'll try to address some of them. Training is always important, and actually, I believe that it might be one of the actual things that can be done and can be done jointly. Just first, nuclear weapon states can share their best practices, like establish some sort of handbooks, like what without like telling away some secrets or things like that, or disclosing sensitive information. Just like how do you run your operations with your hotlines, with your risk reduction centers? It will be really good just to compare the experiences and learn from the best. About management and leadership, I think it is probably less important, but again, just to emphasize that there is a huge value in such working, in the work of these people. So this, I hope I, to some extent, addressed it. And yes, training is hugely important because it's also important with all the emerging disruptive technologies, because unfortunately there are too many people who have an opinion and ready to voice those opinions, including people who are actual like politicians or military officials and so on. They lack basic understanding of what they're talking about. This happens way too often, again, everywhere, and this is a big problem. So my favorite example is like we talk a lot about artificial intelligence, but to some extent things like AI called decision-making support systems, they have existed like for decades. And the problem is not that you should have a human in the loop the whole time. The problem is that this human in this loop should understand what the machine is telling him and what is the basis for the options that he is being provided with the machine. he or she. I think this is hugely important. Again, it's basically training. And on supersonic and probably hypersonic weapons, well, in a perfect world, of course, we should have similar regimes that address all sort of weapons that have huge escalatory potential. And I would say that it is true for all long-range precision weapons. But yeah, now we lack mechanism for control of nuclear weapons. So just to imagine that we can rapidly move to other domains would be too optimistic, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, that we shouldn't think about the possible options. And again, the future is to have some sort of arms control for, as was proposed on the official, including on official level by Russia in something called security equation. You need to address all strategic weapons, nuclear and non-nuclear, offensive and defensive. Yeah, I hope I've answered. I might have missed some of the questions, but I want to give some time to my colleagues. Thank you.
No, thank you. That was very interesting. Dan, and then for the South Asia question, I'll pull in Manpreet and Rabia after Dan.
I'll put in a very quick two-finger that ultimately, if it comes to transferring best practices from the nuclear domain, nuclear hotlines to other domains, it is up to what is your purpose. Do you want to establish a nuclear prevention mechanism where the values on regular institutionalized communication, where both or multiple parties are constantly getting more and more used to such communication and build trust through regular routine? Or is it crisis management where if something breaks out or is clear or close to breaking out, you need people to pick up the phone quickly and be able to escalate, not in the crisis way, but raise the issue of the chain of command to senior leadership. And so for that matter, if you're looking at nuclear crisis prevention mechanisms, the nuclear risk reduction centers are a great example of that with their routine constant notifications going back and forth. If you're looking at crisis management, then something like hotline is much more of an example. And also not just the hotline, but various military deconfliction lines and the mechanisms that Manpreet talked about in her paper, they're all really worth looking into. That's all for me.
Thanks, Dan.
So, in fact, what Dan suggested is what I was going to say. It has to be a mix of the two. You can't have crisis prevention, just at that time picking up the phone. That's why I said habits of engagement that can be built through the process of hotlines give you a sense of comfort to be able to talking, even in times of crisis. So that's why that becomes important. And to Tanvi's question about the prospects of arms control versus CBMs and norm building, I think this has become a global reality today. We used to talk about how difficult it is to do arms control in India, Pakistan, China, given the levels of asymmetry and including on many dimensions. But even before, they could take any of the templates from what was going on globally between particularly US and Russia. We seem to have lost all of that. So arms control or lack of arms control has become a global issue today. And therefore, the tendency will be not to go back to the traditional arms control, which was essentially bipolar between countries that had a symmetry of sorts at both conventional and nuclear level. We'll have to reimagine arms control, and it will largely, I think, be in the form of norms and softer ways of handling the situation rather than the bean counting approach or the ban approach that we had taken in the past. So I think that's where I find we will be moving towards these. And there, the region can also join some of the multilateral efforts at the global level.
Fantastic. Rabia?
Yeah, I would echo what Manpreet has said. Selective compliance, I think it's an excellent question, Tanvi. Inconsistent adherence to established protocols or agreements, particularly during a crisis. And when built into the ethics of hotlines, like you say, it means that parties may choose when to follow communication norms based on convenience or strategic advantage. And that's what we have seen in case of South Asia as well. where one or the other party has been trying to gain strategic advantage by withholding information, in one crisis or the other, and the examples are in front of you. I do believe that, building redundancies in the system, like developing redundant communication channels, can help ensure that communication remains possible, even if one channel is compromised. This, I believe, will reduce the risk of selective compliance affecting overall crisis management efforts. And that's what I say, that if you have a formalized multilateral system, where India and Pakistan, for example, are part of that formalized system, and they are not talking to each other, there are other parties that can push both India and Pakistan to resurrect their bilateral communications. If the DGMO's hotlines or the foreign ministers' hotlines are not being picked up to talk to each other, then there need to be other mechanisms. There need to be back channels happening, and that's what we have seen. How have India and Pakistan survived a number of crises? It has both a good side and a bad side to it, and I've written about outsourcing escalation control, whereby it just gives you that false sense of confidence that third parties will always be there to manage your crisis, and so therefore it's okay if you do not pick up the phone or delay it or withhold information. So it has both the pros and cons. But going forward, we need to have multiple channels, because both India and Pakistan, are still not there yet or mature enough to handle or manage their crisis on their own.
Thank you, Rabia and Manpreet. I think those were some fantastic set of remarks. One comment/question that we received from Bill Moon is something that I know we've already discussed to an extent over here, but this is also something that we often get from different stakeholders, that, okay, yes, we talk about the importance of hotlines, but even when hotlines exist, what happens when your adversary or the opponent does not pick up the phone? And this was a major kind of issue that we saw play out real time, specifically between US and China, and with regards to the spy balloon incident. I know we don't have Tong over here, but I wanted to ask if any one of the panelists wanted to respond to Bill. He's talking about, like, it seems that the existence of hotlines does not guarantee the reduction of risk. Your thoughts? And then also, we're getting a lot of buzz and discussion on, and this is somewhat related, that what happened between India and Pakistan, specifically with the BrahMos incident, why was hotlines not used? So trying to put it in context, that does existence of hotlines guarantee risk reduction, even if the tool and mechanism is available to us? Are we really taking advantage of it? I know, Rabi, you did speak and like put a spin on it, that like we need to perhaps involve third parties, and that's also what IST's push is. The lack of multilateral crisis communication channels amongst all the 9 nuclear armed state is a glaring omission, and therefore if bilateral hotlines fail, then perhaps needs to be like backups of multilateral channels. I see Dan's hand, and then if anybody else wanted to respond to this. Dan?
My first response to Bill is that ultimately, I completely agree, hotlines, nuclear risk reduction centers, other similar confidence building mechanisms, they're a necessary but not a sufficient measure to reduce nuclear risks writ large. And for that matter, yeah, it is ultimately up to the political leaders and the military leaders beholden to those political leaders to pick up the phone and engage in those conversations. And another example that comes to mind is that a lot of Russian officials were not picking up the phone from their American counterparts between the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine and fall of that year, when really initially there was a lot of lack of clarity and absence of transparency over each other's intentions. And so ultimately, it is that political decision that drives the appetite for such risk reduction. And there needs to be a development of shared understanding that that type of communication is essential. And perhaps, multilateralizing it in formal or informal ways is one way to do it, which is why this is something that I don't state in my paper, but a US, UK, French mechanism would in fact also contribute to that by socializing the idea of multilateral crisis communications with the allies of the United States and making them also more acceptant to participating in multilateral mechanisms with the adversaries as well down the line. Thank you.
Rabia.
Yeah.
Thanks.
This does not directly speak to, I think Dan has covered that point. I would go back a bit to selective compliance, and obviously it only does not is not only true for hotlines but also for agreements and sticking to the provisions of it. So Stanley Center in Rusi just published an article that I co-authored with Ruhi Niog, and it talks about the 1988 non-attack agreement. And that is selective compliance, right? So on one hand, India and Pakistan, have these series of crises in which, sometimes hotlines were established, and in the other chosen not to be used. But there is this other agreement of non-attack on each other's nuclear facilities, which has survived all the crises between India and Pakistan, has survived for 33 years and counting. And it goes back to what Dan just said. Is there a shared perception of threat between India and Pakistan? With respect to shared perception of threat, whereby they don't want to bomb each other's nuclear facilities during a crisis, it is important for them to have those shared coordinates. That is why they keep on sharing those coordinates. But the hotlines, they don't need to pick up because, they probably don't want to give the satisfaction to the other side that it's too early on in the conflict or the crisis to give in. That sense of surrender. And it's arrogance, it's ego, it's false confidence. You name whatever name you want to give it, that is in play. So I think we need to have more discussions about what are our shared threat perceptions. And, how can we go together and prioritize, what is important for us during a crisis? Is it to see whether we can go to the next level of escalation or round of escalation before a third party could jump in? Or do we want to nip it in the bud and not, wait to see how far we can push each other's thresholds? So that's a conversation that needs to be had in our region. Thank you.
Manpreet, thank you, Rabia.
So again, I want to echo what Dan and Rabia have said. I think my answer is pretty much the same as theirs. What Dima said when he was speaking for the first time, that if the hotlines have not been used, it's not that the tool is bad. It's just that at that particular moment, it was not seen to be something to be in the interest of a particular nation. And here, what Rabia's point is about having the shared understanding of risk, that are you on the same page in terms of how you're understanding the possibility of risk? And that has to happen in peacetime, not in crisis. Your understanding of risk has to be built during peacetime. And that's why these conversations are just so important. I think also, the BrahMos incident has come up more than once. So when the hotlines were not used, and I think there has been a lot of discussion and debate within India about what should have been done and why it was not done. And I think a lot of lessons have been learned from this episode that was quite unfortunate. But the tendency to assume the worst, that the hotline was not used because there was an intention of some kind, can also be a problem. It might just be a case that there was confusion at this end, that nobody knew what had gone wrong and how it was, or at what level was it to be communicated to the other side. So I think a little bit of that understanding, also there is this lot of anger in Pakistan about why did the international community not make a big deal of what had happened. And I think it was essentially because there wasn't a crisis on. Had it happened in a moment of crisis, everybody would have been very concerned about two nuclear armed states and missiles flying around. But because it was in peacetime, and because India maintains a disentanglement, a point that Dan made, that you are not entangling your conventional and your nuclear system. So the BrahMos was known to be a non-nuclear missile. I think that to some extent helped to lower down the tensions. I'm not saying that India should not have immediately reached out and said that this was an accident, and heads have rolled in the country for what happened. But again, I mean, these are all episodes that we must learn our lessons from and hope that there would not be a crisis, which will sort of make us come back to the negotiating table once it's over. So.
Thank you, Manpreet, for that. I like how you put it, and like I think like because we're also nearing to the end of our discussion today, it's important to also say that even through these crises and because of the BrahMos missile incident, several lessons can be learned and situated within the broader context and literature of crisis communication. I would like to give our panelists under 1 minute. I know to respond to any final concluding thoughts slash remark they have. Something that when I had the opportunity to sit down with Tong Zhao, I asked him that if we were ambassadors of effective, secure, and safe and reliable crisis communication, what should we be doing as ambassadors of crisis communication? So if any one of the panelists also wanted to respond to that, I want to double down on Rabia's shout out to the Stanley Center for Peace and Security, basic across the pond. Very important partners we have along with IST working on effective nuclear crisis communication. I think it's extremely important, but what additional can the NGOs do at a track, say 1.5, track 2 level? I really like the idea of simulating crisis communication, but if our panelists were to put their thinking hats on and be ambassadors of crisis communication, what would be your thoughts? Answers under 1 minute, please, as we want to be respectful of everyone's time and close out. I see Manpreet, Rabia, Dima, and Dan.
So I think if I was the ambassador, I would like to mobilize a kind of a meeting like the Nuclear Security Summit or Nuclear Risk Reduction Summits, in which you would want to do a simulation for the top political leaders, because in a summit, I would expect them to be there. And I think there has to be a top-down approach on this, because at the ground level, the risks are understood. It's the top leaders who are more risk acceptant across the world today, who need to be made more sensitized to what can go wrong if there was no crisis communication. And I would want to do a nuclear risk reduction summit where we do a simulation exercise for them. Thanks.
Right. Perfect. Rabia?
Yeah, very briefly, I like the idea of nuclear summits. I did talk about, simulations, right? So we need to use more empirical data, historical case studies, expert analyses to build a compelling narrative on the importance of secure nuclear crisis communications. There's not enough happening. We are starting at our center at University of Lahore, a Gaming for Peace initiative, whereby we will be talking about nuclear risk reduction and off ramps as opposed to, a warlike scenario. And I think more track twos on this, bringing together, countries where crises have happened, learn from the past, look at the future, see how emerging technologies can be used for de-escalation. Not all the effects of emerging technologies are disruptive. So let's look at those technologies that can help us move towards de-escalation during a crisis. I have yet to read a paper on it. Thank you.
Dimitri.
Yeah, I'll be also very short. I think, again, I can't stop saying it. We need to change the image of crisis communications. That those are basically a very important tool to save your country in a situation of crisis. It's not a sort of like a prize for the other guy. It's not a sort of something you do to look good for other parties. It's basically a tool of national security, much like arms control. It's not something that you do because some people wrote a book that it is good. It is just like an instrument that will help you achieve your security. So this is hugely important, just to keep reminding everyone that it's not some concept written in by some fancy scholars and academics. It's a tool that is used by the governments and should be used more.
Perfect. Changing the image of crisis communication. It's not a favor that we are doing to our adversary. I think that's a good way to put it. Dan, you have the final word.
Wow, no pressure at all there, but I think all of my co-panelists really hit it on the head here, and I will be right there with Manfred at the summit trying to get buy-in from senior leaders, because ultimately, at the end of the day, I think the decision to set up new nuclear crisis communication tools and use them when the time comes for the need for them will be political, and however open officials at the lower level might be for implementing such measures, they will require go-ahead from their leaders, and those are the people that ultimately need to be convinced. So any kind of outreach that can be done targeting them, targeting people below them so that they can raise those ideas up, and generating that momentum is truly essential. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dan. I think Christian and we already have our work cut out for us, but I know we just are running slightly over time, but the couple of things that I would like to say to those whose questions we were unable to answer. We have noted your questions. I think there was a really good question on the effectiveness and robustness of DGMO's hotline from Syed. Will reach out to our panelists with these specific questions. And now to close out, I will not try to summarize this very rich conversation. I think our panelists have done an excellent job, but one common thread that I kept on hearing through everyone's presentation was this lack of shared sense of threat perception on what happens if there is an absent crisis communication. And I think in our work with the working group, that's something that we are trying to find more innovative ways to get around at. But no conversation is complete without a quick round of and vote of thanks. Extremely grateful to Sophia Morrow, our Director of Strategic Communication, for helping us behind the scenes. It's great work. Christian Stein for walking and running with me in locksteps to really seamlessly execute this project, and also Philip Reiner for his constant support and encouragement. I want to thank our panelists again for our fantastic set of remarks. We'll be in touch. Our live audience for putting such great questions and really pushing our panelists to think through some of the more stickier questions, I would say. And then also our partners with the Department of State, NERC. We work very closely with them, and also the Swiss Federal Foreign Office and the German Foreign Office for all their support in making this project a reality. And I think, like as several of you said, that it is time that more organizations like partner and do hand-holding together to really change the image of crisis communication. It's not a favor that you are doing to your adversary, but in this way, you're bolstering your own sense of deterrence. Thank you, and please continue following our work, and all the reports are publicly available for your readership. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Sylvia. Bye-bye. Bye.